The culture of a people that views itself as powerful provides instruction in the restrained use of that power. We see this everywhere, from diverse tribal cultures in the Amazon to Bushido to the Three Kingdoms era of China, where minimal use of force was considered the highest of arts. We see this reflected in international law. We see this reflected in the Geneva Convention. It's everywhere. And not just evident in practical instruction, but also in the stories of those cultures. Populations that view themselves as powerful tell stories about heroes that overcome great odds to the benefit of more than themselves. We also see reflected values like mercy, like nobility. Heroic virtues are defined by this restrained use of power. Cultures that do not view themselves as powerful, all but invariably cultures that have been conquered by another culture, usually through military or economic force, do not tell those sorts of stories. Or rather, do not exclusively tell those sorts of stories. There is a different sort of instruction provided in how power can be and should be used. There we find the sabotage heroes, the trickster heroes. And there the message is that power is to be used wherever it can yield effect. Quite the opposite of restraint. The victories there tend to be smaller, less overcoming than subversive, unlike stories of powerful heroes. These figures, at the end of the narrative, have done nothing to change the fundamental conditions in which they exist or in which the people around them exist. Whatever they achieve in the course of the story, they are defined as powerless to change the circumstances in which the story takes place. Another reliable correlation between the nature of these stories and the conditions of the people who tell them is that the people who prove most effective at changing the conditions of oppression into which they were born are those that reject the trickster narratives, those that reject the description of themselves as powerless. The examples from the 20th century that spring to mind are Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Mahatma Gandhi. For all their differences, they shared a common rejection of the notion that they were powerless and the associated notion that they should use power however they could. They thoroughly rejected the slave population ethic of any damage that you can do is worth doing. Inside this narrative of powerlessness and a valuing of trickery and having effect wherever one can have effect, we frequently see an elevation, an enshrinement of ridicule. This was all but theologically formalized in slave populations in Brazil, but we also saw it reflected in slave populations in North America as well. We may be tempted to say that this parallels other humor-oriented traditions like satire, but the function of ridicule to have effect, any effect, most notably to upset the person who is being ridiculed, and the function of satire to illustrate a principle are very, very different. Ridicule for effect is not required to, and only coincidentally, if ever, illustrates some underlying principle or sheds light on some social condition or absurdity. Ridicule for effect is distinct, psychologically, sociologically, and anthropologically, from ridicule to illustrate. And at this point, you can probably tell where I'm going with this. Trolling, ownage, all of it. These are the hallmarks of a slave culture. A culture that views itself as enslaved, that views itself as incapable of affecting the circumstances that it finds miserable. This is cultural instruction in one's own powerlessness and is incompatible with the perspectives necessary to effect real change. It is reflective of an internalization of despair that has given up even describing its own conditions as objectionable, that has given up on any application of personal or collective power that could have lasting effect. And at this point, we can apply countless speeches and sermons from the 20th century, many coming from those aforementioned three, to the conditions in which we're in. The crabs in a bucket analogy, rats in a sinking ship. But I think the most important is one of Malcolm X's main themes, which is that one can never, will never escape slavery without first ceasing to act like a slave.
Now, a component of this is the culture of cool, the concept of cool. Before, cool simply meant socially desirable. Cool meant, specifically, an ability to be unaffected, an ability to be non-responsive to the conditions or events surrounding oneself. Cool owes its origins to a literal reference, a literal descriptor. It did originally refer to temperature, that one could keep their cool, regardless of the heat that they were working in. The term is an inheritance from African American culture in America, and that gives us a specific image that we can draw from. Working in extreme heat and keeping your cool. This ties into the self-perceived inability to affect the conditions that one is in. You can't change the heat of the day. You can change how you respond to it. You can change how you let it affect you. As a selective response, it's profoundly useful and a necessary component of maturation. As a uniform response, as our response to everything, as our response to any form of adversity or undesirable condition, we're getting back into that problem of perceiving oneself as unable to affect the conditions around them. Cool has, in recent times, come full circle. Even where the word cool is absent, we, in contemporary culture, often represent it as socially desirable to be unaffected. This plays deeply into the unwritten rules of antagonism and interpersonal contest on the internet, in which the person who has a reaction is the person who loses. The person who lets the other person emotionally or psychologically affect them has lost the contest, has lost the game. Responding to ridicule as undesirable, and responding in such a way that is indicative of one's perception of an ability to affect it, like getting angry. Angry is a state in which there is some expectation of at least potential of change. Anger is an impactful emotion. It is an emotion that motivates impactful behavior, positively or negatively. The negative social connotations of expressed anger, or distress, or being upset, play into this culture of cool, this culture in which it is socially desirable to be unaffected by what is going on around one. In embracing that, however, there is tacit acceptance of the conditions that one is in. There is acceptance of the idea that we are unable to affect it. This posturing also has a disastrous effect on our emotional intelligence, on our ability to differentiate between different states within ourselves, or to correctly infer what is going on in somebody else based on their behavior. When all manifest responses are treated as equivalent, that being losing. And that's all we're looking for, whether or not somebody has lost, or lost it, or lost their cool. We don't learn to differentiate, or forget how to differentiate between differing kinds of responses. I can't count the number of times that I've seen somebody online suggesting that somebody else was about to cry when, in point of fact, what they were displaying was rage. Now, as we become more stupid about the emotional responses of others, about being able to correctly read them or correctly associate them, we become more stupid about interpreting our own emotional responses. Now, why this kind of behavior comes out on the internet has been the subject of countless discussions. Common wisdom puts it as a combination of the anonymity factor, that this is how people want to behave, that when the limitations that we impose because of accountability or perception of others are lifted, that this is just what comes out. That perspective informs a very, very dim view on human character. One that there's certainly some evidence for, but I think there's more to it than that. In an earlier series, I posited that this is in part due to the way that anonymizing factor reverses the cycle of generational social instruction, that rather than 13-year-olds getting their cues on how to behave from adults, it's happening the other way around. That's also part of it, but I don't think that's the whole story either. All of these theories talk about why it is permitted to be expressed, why it comes out, but none of them really ask the question of why it's there in the first place, why we have this in us to express in the first place. The internet is still, to a degree, linguistically regionalized. The English-speaking internet is the most populous. There are more sites that carry exclusively English language content than any other kind of linguistic exclusivity. But there are regions of the internet that are non-English linguistically exclusive. And we can infer some things from what we see going on, say, the Arabic-speaking corner of the internet, or the Korean, or the Japanese. The trolling phenomenon seems to be not exclusive to, but certainly disproportionately weighted in, the English-speaking section of the internet. It's not intrinsic to the medium, nor is it reflective of something intrinsic to human character. Without those innateness cop-out arguments available, we are left with the question, and have to ask the question, where did it come from? Because it came from somewhere. I think part of it came from this slave ethic culture that I was just talking about. From the standpoint of cultural anthropology or sociology, the voice of the internet is the voice of a conquered people, an enslaved people. This is how slaves behave. This is how a conquered culture acts. These are the values of a conquered culture. And that's where the permissiveness of the medium comes into play. Because we do not identify as a conquered culture. We do not identify as a slave culture. As I discussed earlier in the American Dreaming series, we have profound social stigma attached to self-describing as disempowered. In our day-to-day lives, we act like members of an empire, a conquering empire, a dominant empire. But the second we have available to us a medium of expression absent social sanction or accountability, we act like slaves. We act like people who feel profoundly disempowered, who feel completely unable to positively impact their quality of life. I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're seeing an expression of hidden frustrations and the frustration of a double standard. That we are expected, that we are required to identify as successful, to identify as culturally conquering rather than conquered, when in point of fact we feel quite the opposite. We do not feel like we won the war. We do not feel like we are the victor. The expressions manifest in behavior, in behavioral selection, are more reliably accurate than the statements that we actually make. Very few of us, and certainly at the sociological level, an insignificant portion of us, know how to lie in our behavior. We know how to lie in our word choice. We know how to lie in our overt expression. But in terms of the messages that we convey in how we behave, in the choices that we make, in the priorities that we affirm through the choices that we make, very few of us are adept liars. Regardless of what we say, how we say it, and especially how we say it in a context absent perception of accountability, says that we feel like we're slaves, says that we feel like a conquered people. So long as we're okay with affirming that message in our behavior, we are okay with that message. As long as we are okay with affirming our identity as broken, disempowered, and enslaved through our behavior, through our behavioral selections, we are accepting our condition as enslaved. As I said earlier, liberation movements in the past have illustrated, sometimes behaviorally and sometimes overtly, sometimes through overt statement, that a necessary component of the liberation process is rejecting the slave identity. And a key aspect of rejecting an identity construct, whether self-imposed or externally imposed, is acting contrary to it. If we don't want to feel like slaves, if we want to begin to chip away at the practical conditions that inform those feelings, a necessary step is to stop acting like slaves.